And over to you, Ivan. Ivan is definitely a very known face in our community, and I think overall Microsoft and Azure community, I would say throughout the globe. He runs a very popular podcast, and he has been with Microsoft for how many? I know it's decade for
15. Yeah, I'm
15.
coming up on finishing my 14th year, so I'll be starting actually in next week. I'll start my 15th year here. So let me start this before I forget. Let's see, window. Let me launch this. Yeah. So sort of real brief on me. So I'm actually a degreed chemical engineer. I did a bunch of textile stuff before textiles left the United States and had to go do IT. Ended up at Microsoft doing support for them. And early in 2008, I had this demo of what became SQL Azure, and I was just floored. Right, I just thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. It didn't even do T-SQL yet. It was still just purely a REST API, which is kind of ironic given where REST APIs have come. But we were just sort of ahead of our time, and so I marched down to my director's office and said, "I want in on that." And in hindsight, I wish I could say that I had this vision, that I knew cloud was going to be the thing. But no, I just saw this really cool technology and wanted to get in on that. And so, ever since then, I've been doing Azure, and done most of the big services, AAD, compute, networking, app service. Spent a good bit of time with app services, and really, the wide range of it. The last few years, I've been focused on. I work now in the customer experience team, and just to make sure you guys can see the slide deck, not the. Okay, cool. So, I've been working in the customer experience team, and we focus on sort of that interface between the component teams, the support ecosystem, and customers. Nobody ever talks to me when things are going well. It's always when something's broken, but that teaches us a lot about what we need to do to fix to make customers resilient. And that's really where this talk came about. This is about sort of how customers should think about resiliency, how we think about resiliency from the Microsoft side, and then ultimately how we partner with y'all, because we could build all the features we want. If customers don't take advantage of them, then it doesn't do any good. Conversely, if our platform is completely unreliable, and yes, I know we had a couple outages in the last couple of weeks, but if our platform's completely unreliable, then it doesn't matter, what customers do on top of it, it's going to hurt them. But if you build your app right, it actually doesn't matter if we have outages, right? And so we'll talk about that stuff. The other thing too, so as far as I'm concerned, I'll send Niraj a copy of this deck after we get out of the meeting. And as far as I'm concerned, if all we do is I throw this slide on and then y'all start asking questions and we talk about whatever we want to talk about, I'm good, right? I certainly have content I want to share with you guys, but if we just get off into wherever and start talking about stuff, that's a useful conversation to me. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to just pipe up. I think that I can see the chats as they come across as well, but if I miss it, just holler out on voice, right? There's not enough listening here.
Things there. We are recording this session right now, and I'm going to put it on our YouTube channel, and I'll put the link to the YouTube channel in the comments for this.
Awesome.
So everyone gets it. And this kind of interesting comment Ivan made around ahead of time, right? Kind of like the way the things are evolving. I think Microsoft started with PaaS, right? And everybody said that it was really not the right thing, or it would really not gel with enterprises and so on. Or that hybrid strategy, I think, was one of the first companies to lay out that vision with the Azure Pack at that point in time, as it was called. And with the cloud, I think after probably 10 years or 9 years or whatever, I think now industry is moving towards that serverless. So if you look at serverless, it's kind of a glorified PaaS in many ways, right? And I think the whole notion of hybrid, that every other cloud provider now has got a hybrid model to operate. So it's been really interesting, that ahead of time kind of a thing. But yeah. Just thought I was just discussing that some like other day with a customer, and it was I felt it was very interesting observation. So I just wanted to call that out since I haven't mentioned it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point there, Raj. I mean, it's sort of, we were too fast in the wrong direction. Or I guess too fast in the right direction, maybe is a better
Right.
way to say it. And it's just sort of took the industry some time to come back around. So this is what I would sort of want to chat about today, right? So I talked about how it's a partnership. I want to sort of share about how to approach this. Also, talk about some things we're doing on our side to improve this, and then talk about the accountability from the customer side, right? And like I said, on the questions, right, just holler out. We'll just go as we go along. Before we go any further, though, and anybody who has ever seen me talk before knows that I harp on this. It is on premises with an S. Some of my friends and coworkers who've known me for a long time, make a wonderful game out of sending me public documentation that we have on the Microsoft side, where we are using it incorrect. And no kidding, I will do PRs to get it fixed. I chase those when I see them. But it's like everything else. This is not just a cloud problem, right? Everything that you see and everything we'll talk about, right? It was an on-premises problem first, and now it's a cloud problem as well. So let's talk about sort of what reliability and resilience are, right? So the reliable applications, right, are resilient in the fact that they can recover from some sort of failure, either with a fast recovery or no data loss. They're highly available, right? So they can continue to run no matter what's going on underneath them, even if they have some reduced functionality. And then they have a disaster recovery plan, right? If you've got all those things, your app is probably pretty reliable. Now, the reality is everybody is sort of on a different continuum with that, right? I know a lot of customers that, hey, they have a really good DR plan, but they're using it all the time because their app is not highly available, or customers that have, a decent HA story, but when that HA solution fails for whatever reason, like, I was working with a customer today, they have app services, multiple app services deploy a completely PaaS architecture, deployed into a single Microsoft region. So if we lose that region, they are completely out of luck. They actually have a DR plan. They've never tested it. They've never used it. And when their site was down, we said, hey, can you fail over? They said, well, we don't know. And they were afraid to try it. By the time they got around being comfortable trying it, we had fixed the service issue. But the downside is they ended up with about an hour's worth of downtime, right? So you got to have all three of these as you go through. And it's a partnership, right? As I mentioned earlier. So we're accountable on the Azure side for just delivering a resilient, reliable platform. That doesn't mean we won't have outages. Right? Outages, we've had outages in the past. We will continue to have outages in the future, as do our competitors, right? Everybody has outages. And I'm sure all of you who manage apps or support apps, right? You have outages. It is never, ever going to go away because it's this software built by humans. But you can do things to make sure that you're as resilient as possible given the business investment that you're choosing to make, right? And this is where customers are accountable for building this into their application, right? Leveraging the features and functionalities that we provide. So this is a pyramid, right? On the bottom is the resilient foundation that we built. This is things, like availability zones. This is things like making sure that our compute infrastructure is resilient and has the right level of sort of uptime, right? Is the racks that we build, do they have, and it's a little bit simplistic, but I'll use it because everybody seems to get it. But do we build racks that have redundant power supplies, right? That's sort of the basics. If we only had a single power supply, then, you get one failure and you lose an entire rack, right? That's not a resilient foundation. Then on top of that, we build resilient services. This is, we were talking about, the things like ASR, right? ASR falls in this category. ASR is a service. Azure Site Recovery is a service that people can use for their disaster recovery scenario, for their backup scenarios. But there's also things like availability zones. There's things like zonally aware apps, PaaS services like zonally aware app services or zonally aware express route gateways. And then there's the application layer, right? the application itself has to have some capabilities built into it on its own. Again, a good example is the app services. If you deploy your app on app services, but if you don't deploy a zonally aware variant, then you're not taking advantage of the resiliency that we provide, and you're not as resilient as you think you are, right? You're only as resilient at that point as our underlying services are, right? And so you're missing some opportunities. And Neeraj and I were chatting about this earlier, talking about sort of the continuum of the cloud service model. And to be clear, all four of these are totally valid working models, right? It really depends on your business requirements, your business need, and sort of what the business requirements are that are driving the question, right? On the far left, we've got traditional on-premises stuff. You as a customer have full control top to bottom, everything from the physical hardware everything runs on, all the way up to the applications that you install yourself. The downside is you get all that flexibility, you get all that control, but there's a high cost associated with that. High cost and sort of a slow ability to make changes, right? Anybody that's been in this business for a while probably remembers what would happen when you would order a new server, 4 or 5 years ago, right? You order it, 3 months later, purchasing finally gets it, and it shows up. It gets installed in the data center. Now you got to configure everything. I mean, you're talking 6 months to get it in, and then invariably, what happens is you under provisioned or over provisioned it, right? So now you're stuck bearing that cost for eternity at that point, and that's not a great way to run your business. You don't have the flexibility, and you don't have the pace that you want. So moving over to the right, we've got infrastructure as a service. In that case, we as a cloud provider take care of all the physical infrastructure as well as we provide you the OS. Right? You have access to the OS and you can make changes to it, but we're providing it all the way up to that layer. Moving one over to platform as a service, right now we push up into the runtime, and all you really own is your application and your data. And then software as a service is on the far right. Again, a really good example of software as a service is Office 365, right? I will tell you that today, Office 365 is 100% running on top of our core server software that we've had for years, Exchange, SharePoint. But if we ripped out Exchange tomorrow and replace it with some, open source email system, as long as all the functionality that was there the day before is still there, you as a customer never know, right? It's not really, a concern for you because you're just using the service. If we talk about infrastructure as a service, going platform as a service, going to software as a service, right? As you lose that control, your cost and your effort involved in provisioning it and managing it goes down, right? Because you're responsible for less and less, but you are giving up that control, right? But again, it's all what matched to your business model, right? Some people still need that on-premises control. Other people are good all the way to software as a service, and it really depends decision to decision. So let's talk about the reliability and resilience, like how you approach thinking about it in that context. So let's talk about a sort of a use case. In this case, I like to talk about VMs. You can do this for any service, but I think VMs are the easiest for people to get their heads wrapped around because you don't add in some of the complexity there. But let's talk about a single VM, right? So today, if I deploy a single VM with premium or ultra disk underneath it, so basically our SSD drives, I have a 99.9 SLA, right? So about 9 hours a year of downtime. And my storage redundancy is, at 11 nines at that point. And this is using locally redundant storage. And what that is my data is replicated within the data center, within the region that it starts, right? So if I lose the region, I lose the data, but as long as I don't lose the region, that's still accessible. So now let's say you decide that 99.9 is not sufficient resilience and availability for you. You want to go up to a slightly higher level. Well, now within a single data center, you can elevate up to an availability set. A classic example of this would be some sort of clustered application where you have two nodes. They're clustered, so they're keeping your application up. And then underneath it, you have two VMs that by putting them in an availability set, we on the Microsoft side guarantee that they do not share a fault domain or an update domain. And what that means is that we will never, either through an unexpected failure or some sort of upgrade, take both of those VMs down at the same time. Conceptually, from a fault domain perspective, think about a rack, right? It's not exactly the right way to think about it, but conceptually, if I have two racks next to each other, the only common hardware between those two is really the network cable, right? There's going to be different power going to those. I can lose an entire rack and not impact the other rack. I would have to lose a wide range of my data center to be able to impact both racks. And again, still using that locally redundant storage, but in this case, I've elevated to Azure Managed Disks. This means that we on the Microsoft side are sort of managing the IOPS associated with your disk versus with the original one, you yourself are making sure that you distribute your VMs across your storage accounts so you're not overusing it. You sort of get extra reliability by just changing your architecture. Now let's take it up one more notch. So now let's say you tell me, hey, I can't afford, if you lose a chunk of your data center, to lose both of my VMs. Now, so what we do is you leverage availability zones. Now, availability zones at a high level, you could think about them as if they were independent data centers that just happen to sit under one big roof, right? So there is no shared infrastructure between those zones, and there's no shared power, no shared cooling, no shared networking, nothing, right? There's no cross dependencies between those zones. I could completely turn off one zone. The other zone would continue along just on its own. Again, similar to the concept I was talking about with multiple racks. Now I'm taking it to multiple zones within the data center. Again, if I lose an entire data center, you're still down, but you've significantly increased your uptime. At that point, you're taking it up to 4 nines, and now you've dropped your annual downtime to less than an hour, right? Now, none of this is for free, right? There is some additional cost associated with going from the left to the right, but it's a business decision. If you're doing a dev test workload, you're all the way on the left, right? If you're doing some, mission critical application where downtime is just cannot happen, you're going to be all the way on the right. We've got retailers that are on our on the Azure platform. As we go into Black Friday for those retailers, the reason it's called Black Friday is they go from being in the red and basically losing money for the year to being profitable for the year. So for those folks, you're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a minute when if something goes down on Black Friday. And so for those folks, not only do they want all of the zonal redundancies, they're all the way over on the right, and they've got some sort of DR strategy so that if we lose an entire region, they're able to, through a combination of things like Traffic Manager or Azure Site Recovery, replicate the data to the secondary region so they can immediately flip over and very quickly recover the application, and now it's running in this second region. Right? When you do that, you're at this point, you've got your DR story. It's sort of comes to a different conversation when we talk about your availability at that point, because it's about your app will go down as part of this failover, but it's about reducing, the amount of time it takes you to recover this, right, to get this back up. And that's a function again of sort of how you design the site recovery design, and is your data, actively replicated, passively replicated, whatever the case may be. Any questions about that before I go on to the next section? I mean, this is sort of a key concept, right, to think about. It's a business question of where you need to be on this continuum.
I have one question.
Sure.
Even I know you're talking about the things which we can actually control meaning availability zone control by an app as an app developer, app infrastructure, or as a company as a whole. But what are the things like Azure AD for which the stability issue happened last month or earlier this month?
What outage? I don't know anything about any AD last month. No. So yeah, that's a really fair question. So there are services that we consider to be dial tone. These are services that it's either really, really, really hard to design, or to design your own redundancy on that, or it's something that it just can't go down. DNS is a good example, right? Like I don't care what you design, if core DNS goes down, your app's down and gone. Those are ones that we look at really, really hard about where are our single points of failure, where are the lessons and learnings whenever we do have an outage to work around that. And we also build and manage those services, knowing that it's sort of impossible for you to design around that, right? You know, the AAD one is interesting because if you look at it really closely, and this is public knowledge, so this is not anything secret here. What actually happened is we had a problem with our what we call our safe deployment process, which is the process by which we roll out code. And this is a model that is generally accepted in the industry, where you roll it out to a small area, to a small slice of your production code. If it looks stable, you move it to a larger slice, and you keep going, right? So you find any bugs you find them early on. Well, in that particular case, we actually had a bug in our safe deployment process where it ended up rolling out the code change to the entire globe all at once, right? And so what we are doing now is we're going and we're taking, and this is sort of where looking at it at a cloud scale comes in. AAD is using sort of a proprietary safe deployment model and system that they built based on their requirements, many, many years ago. Azure as a whole, who has sort of figured out this problem across multiple services, multiple components, has a more generic model that is better bake tested and has all these different services banging on it beyond just AAD. So what we're going to do, one of the big learnings from here is that AAD they were in the process of moving to this. They're going to accelerate their move. And then the expectation is, early to mid next year, they'll be fully on the Azure one. But that's one where, because we recognize that not just does the service have to stay up, but we have to be able to manage the management of the service, right? We've got to remove those pain points, those failures in resiliency, right? Which that rollout and that basically we broke our own availability zone promise, right? Yeah. Because when we push the code out to multiple zones, multiple regions, we broke you in multiple regions at once, right? Yeah. And so I think that it is one of those areas where there is no good answer, because I'm not going to sit here and tell you, hey, we'll never break, AAD, for example, in that way ever again. But what I can say is we absolutely recognize that there is a set of services that you can't design around, right? MFA, you can sort of design a break glass model around, right? And there is the ability to do a secondary MFA provider. But core authentication, you can't use it. Heck, these days, if AAD doesn't work, you've got on-premises apps that are probably breaking these days, right? Because you've taken dependencies on that as an identity service. And so, so we totally get it. There is no great answer in terms of like, here's how you work around it, which is why we're investing the work to make sure that the service actually has that availability. Does that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
So
no, that's a good question.
Sure. Yeah. How about the latency impacts in terms of storage replication, since you are just replicating this across regions, probably coast to coast or even across continents at times? From a customer standpoint, are there any considerations there which we need to?
Are you talking in terms of the possibility of data loss because of the asynchronous replication, Neeraj, or are you talking about my app is now up and it's calling across the world?
Is not. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say, are you talking about the replication itself, or are you talking about, hey, my app now is failed over and now I'm calling a storage account that's somewhere across the world?
From the storage standpoint, I assume that whenever it fails over, both the storage and the VM will be in the same data center at that point.
Okay.
Same voltage zone. But just from a storage replication standpoint, are there any latency impacts there from a customer standpoint, which we should be aware of as we are planning this?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So when we talk about zonally redundant storage and locally redundant and geo-redundant storage, there is the concept of a read-only secondary, right? Especially when we talk about the geo-redundant, it's called the I forget what we call it, but basically RA. It's read access globally redundant storage or something. Just put those words together in some random order, but it gets the concept across. But basically what we're saying in that world, and this is a lesson we took from the outage we had in South Central maybe 2.5 years ago or so, is today prior to this, that replication was asynchronous. And we, Microsoft, made the decision to say, okay, your primary is dead. It's not coming back up anytime soon. So we're going to fail over to your secondary. But that data is there. And theoretically, if you as a business or you as an application owner say, hey, you know what? That data is all transactional anyway. I don't really need the old data, or I'm okay if I lose a couple records. I need to get my business back up. In that scenario, there is the potential for data loss because the replication is asynchronous. But you now have the ability to sort of set a flag that says, flip the switch and say, I want to fail over my storage account so that I can now make what was a read-only secondary into my read-write primary at that point. And now you can fully use it, sort of as, however your application makes. But yes, you're absolutely right. And this is why we're really super careful when we do this, because there is always the possibility of data loss when you do that failover to take, this region that was secondary to primary. Now, typically our latency is order of magnitude of, you're talking, tens of seconds, maybe into minutes to get that data across. But it's not zero. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. I think you said yes, but you were on mute.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't ASR only have a 4-hour quiescence window? Like you can only get a quiesce backup every 4 hours anyway.
I'm not sure what we do on Azure Backup. It wouldn't surprise me if we have some sort of, hey, you can't take a backup every, 5 seconds on the entire machine. I do know that when we start talking about, I'm pretty sure when we start talking about things like transaction logs and everything that are more time sensitive, you can do those more often. But if you're doing the entire machine, I think there are some limitations. Yeah, I mean, the speed of light is, no matter what we do, it's still a thing, right? Latency across the globe, latency across the US is going to be 70 milliseconds for the rest of my life and the rest of everybody else's life. Speed of light's the speed of light. Same thing is true with replication, right? No matter how fast we push it across, it's going to be non-zero. So we took, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just totally agreeing with you. It's a hard lesson to teach to people. And I'm like, if you want redundancy, build it into the app. This is all covering your ass on the other end of that equation.
Absolutely. And again, that's sort of the whole mantra here, right? With the partnership, right? We're going to build in the best features and the best capabilities. And to be honest, we're shooting for the, you've seen our SLA numbers for our services, we're shooting for the best availability we can, right? But if, and this is actually good timing to have this slide. I was going to skip this slide, but since we've got it up here, right? Even if I achieve 99.9, that's 9 hours of downtime a year. If your app can't take that, then you need to layer in some things on top of that. And we'll talk about some of that as we go into the next sections. The other thing too, and it's not on this slide, but you could sort of imagine another column next to the SLA. The more nines you add to that number, your cost goes up substantially as you go through, especially as you start getting, into the 5 nines, 6 nines, 7 nines, right? The ability and the amount of effort you have to put to achieve that goes up exponentially as you go there. So I have seen customers make the mistake. I was actually talking to somebody a couple months ago, right, where we said, okay, well, what's your SLA for this app? They said, well, during our busy season, we want 5 nines. During the rest of the year, we want, 4 nines. Okay, that's not a bad thing to start. What's the impact to your business if your app goes down for an hour? Well, the end users, they'll retry a little bit later. They'll go get some lunch and they'll come back. So wait a minute, you're okay with an hour of downtime, but you're telling me that you want to design for 5 minutes of downtime. Are you sure you want the extra cost? Right? Oh, no. Well, we don't really want to use Traffic Manager. We don't want to have multiple app service deployments. Well, wait a minute, you're sort of being a little bit schizophrenic here, right? Like either your business needs it from a design perspective, or you're just building this hypothetically really reliable system that nobody wants to pay for, right? Now, what they did that would actually give them credit to this customer, they're one of the few customers I've talked to that actually thinks about their availability. For, whether or not their numbers are correct or not, it's an interesting debate, but they're actually thinking about busy season, non-busy season, right? For retailers, availability is a bigger deal during the holiday season than it is in, maybe August, right? And so that's a good thing to think about as well, right? It's not just sort of your all up number, but what does it look like as you go through the cycles of your business? So, and this goes to, what we were just talking about, right? So those numbers we talked about, those are per service. Now when you start thinking about what your application is going to do, you got to do a little bit of math, because now we have to talk about composite ones. So let's talk about a simple scenario. We're going to use PaaS services here because it just makes life a little bit easier. Let's say you got an app service deployment, you got an Azure SQL database, and you got some blob storage. App services is 99.95, SQL database is 4 nines, and blob storage is 3 nines for LRS. So to get your composite SLA, you multiply all those out. Now your aggregate SLA is 99.84. So your SLA from an application perspective is by definition going to be lower. Going to be lower than each individual service, because theoretically they could be down at the same time, right? Or actually, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Most likely they're not going to be down at the same time. So you end up with an aggregate downtime across those. And that's the starting point. And if that number is not sufficient for your business goal, now you need to start thinking about your next things, right? And we talked about some of this before, right? What's the impact of additional downtime, right? So go back to this number here, right? So at 99.84, right, you're looking at somewhere on the order of, somewhere on the order of, 6 or 7 hours a year of downtime, right? If your business can handle that, great, you're done. If your business can't handle that and that doesn't meet the expectations, you got to do a little bit more work. So that's where you start talking about things like, recovery point objective, or RPO, your RTO, how much money are you willing to invest in this? And what's your service level objective, right? What are you measuring, and how are you going to measure it? And what should that measurement be? So you throw all that in a blender, right? And now you come out and you say, okay, so 99.85 is not sufficient. I need a bigger number. So how do you get a bigger number? Well, the only way to take a composite SLA and make that number bigger is to layer in a service that has higher availability, right? So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to take two 99.84 composite SLAs. We're going to layer in Traffic Manager, and now we have a 99.96 availability. So we probably drop, I think I'll go back and look at the slide deck, but I think we're probably down on the order of about 4 hours. I'm sorry, about 4 or 5 hours of downtime a year. At that point, close to half of what we were before, right? Just by layering in Traffic Manager. Now, it's not free. You now have to deploy 2 ASEs. You now have to deploy 2 Azure SQL databases, right? But if you need that availability, you need it. And this is where you can play with, scaling, and you can play with auto scaling, and play with all that to sort of drive down the cost of your backup site. But you're going to need both of those if you really need to achieve that availability. Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
I have a question. So
Sure.
Recently there was an article about Walmart. I never read the full version of it. Are they using something like this now?
You mean in terms of, multi-region, yeah, absolutely. Somebody like Walmart, right, is absolutely going to be using this level of redundancy, if not more so, right? Because again, we talked about, they're sort of the prototypical, retailer around Black Friday. I don't, offhand, I don't know what it would cost Walmart to be down by the minute, but I'm guessing it's in the high order of that millions of dollars per minute, right? And so for them, they're going to say, okay, well, Traffic Manager across 2 regions isn't good enough for me. I need it across 3 regions, right? Or, hey, I need, zones, availability zones, and then within the zones, I'm going to do regions, and then within the regions, I'm going to do zones, so that even if Microsoft loses, an entire region and 1 zone, right? We do an AAD type mistake and we deploy code to multiple regions inadvertently. As long as we don't do it into both zones in both regions, they still have a single zone up. They have that availability, right? So this is where sort of defining what your requirements are, as you go through. And again, I don't know the specifics of, what they're doing in terms of exactly what their layout looks like, but I strongly suspect that, let's say they do, for sake of conversation, they're doing 3 regions, each region, they deploy it in both zones, and they get traffic manager across it. I suspect that during the rest of the year, maybe they only run 2 regions, right? So they sort of have a primary and a secondary, but they don't have the tertiary, right, at that point. It's sort of, again, it's designing to what the impact on your business is. Right? If you're a retailer like a Walmart during the holiday season, if you're talking millions or potentially tens of millions of dollars a minute, tertiary, even, a 4th region, 5th region, right? That's sort of the conversation that you have to go through to your head. The other thing that I will say too, I've had this conversation with a couple of customers recently, is assume, we obviously are trying to achieve success on our side. We're trying to provide the capabilities and resiliency that you as a customer need, but your peak season is not the time to try and save on cost, right? We endeavor to keep capacity available. We endeavor to prevent bugs in our software. We endeavor to make sure that if you want to scale up, you can scale up, all that kind of stuff, right? We're going to have mistakes. We're going to have misses, right? If your business or your annual, sort of ability to be profitable is dependent on us not having a software bug or not having a provisioning failure during your, peak window, don't mess around. Do it ahead of time. Pre-scale, right? Again, it's sort of like we did it on premises where everybody bought for their biggest day. But the beauty of the cloud is you buy for your biggest day, and then 2 days later, you scale it down to not your biggest day, right? Yep. You actually have that flexibility. So that ability to be flexible can lead some people to some traps, right? They want to be so flexible that they don't want to spend the money to give themselves a little bit of extra redundancy and a little bit of extra resilience. I don't recommend going that way. Good question. Okay, let's see. So we talked about multi-region.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Back one. So you've got traffic manager. I try to think about it as control plane and data plane.
Yep.
So traffic manager is protecting your control plane. You have Azure backup, whatever it is, protecting your data plane. But is there anything in Azure Intelligent Cloud or something that protects you from like an ounce of prevention's worth of pound of cure, protects you from suffering a real data plane issue where you really lose out on the data? You don't know how far back to go. Does that make sense? Like if you got ransomware or something.
Are you talking about, if you don't get a request, you don't know you didn't get it? Is that sort of what you're asking about? Or
I'm thinking of a situation where my actual app is fine, but if I had a cybersecurity threat and the malicious attack happened, but I was unaware, and it deleted my oldest records and was coming toward my newest. So everybody's day-to-day operations are fine. They don't realize until it's all deleted. I'm going to have to go back and find out at some point when that happened to restore my data plane and piece it together. Is there something that Azure does today that can prevent that?
Okay. So good question. Although I would say back up just a little bit. I would say traffic manager is actually more about your data plane than your control plane, right? Because traffic manager is about directing your data plane traffic to wherever is available, right? So Azure, I don't know that Azure really does it. We do it as features, right? There's backup features. There's storage account, like blob storage now has the ability to do idempotent storage, right? So we make a copy if you make a change and your old one is still there that you can go back to, right? So we layer in features like that. Beyond that, I don't know that the cloud inherently brings sort of any other protection against that stuff, other than the fact that by virtue of being such a, for lack of a better word, rich target, right? What we do have visibility into is we do have visibility into everybody doing bad stuff. If they attack if they attack me, well, we see that, we take that data and say, this is the signature, this is the behavior. If we see them attacking Josh in the same fashion, we get ahead of it. We block that IP, we turn off that, resource, or we prevent that, wherever that vector is, we automatically, whatever the path is that they're getting in, we figure out some way to block it for all of our customers, rather than, in the old days, right? The on-premises world, great. I shipped all kinds of, or ship all kinds of security fixes, but if you don't install them, you're not getting any benefit, right? So that's one of the benefits. If you think about IaaS, right, and you think about, PaaS, and even as you get into SaaS, right, what you're doing is you're taking part of losing that control is it means that we can sort of make sure that everything below that is handled. And we take security incredibly serious. There's a lot of spaces where we say, hey, customer, unless our hardware fails, we're not going to reboot you, sort of where we know it's going to cause impact. We're not going to do it without telling you, except if it's a security issue. Right. If for any of you guys who've been on the platform long enough, back in early 2018, my first ever on-call rotation with my brand new team, the CPU vulnerabilities were disclosed early. Right. We were in the process of patching all of Azure. We rebooted functionally the entire Azure cloud in about 72 hours. Right. Because it was the right, as much as we knew it was going to cause impact for our customers, it was the right thing to do from a security vulnerability perspective.
Hey, even just one question about the resiliency. Yeah. Of course, it's very important for. Just think about like a startup, right? If a startup company and if they're growing, right?
Yep.
And the traffic is increasing, and if they do not know whether the traffic is increasing, do we have any kind of learning happening on the traffic level that okay, and then recommendation, hey, you need to do something like this, maybe a different zone because of so much of traffic.
Yes. Yeah, no. So what we do is, so one of the services that we have built into Azure is called Azure Advisor. It's actually one of the more underutilized services that I love personally. I've actually submitted some recommendations to it that are in production. In that we will look at your deployment, we will look at what you're doing, we will look at the platform telemetry about your service, and we'll say things like, hey, it looks like you're not running this with an AV set, right? Or hey, you're not running this, gateway with in a zonally aware SKU. If you need that level of resiliency, you need to turn on this feature, right? Trying to sort of highlight that stuff for customers before they get surprised by it.
But is it doing by looking at the pattern? Like if I'm a startup and started my company.
Oh, you're saying sort of like mining the data coming in
and learning from it, like some kind of machine learning, right? You don't want like if I get recommendation, I just start up a company and then the 5 people know about this my website. I don't want to turn on the vScale set or something like that, right?
Yep.
I really want to know when it is really. Don't tell me at the end of it, right?
Yeah. Sort of but catch me as it's growing. No, so today we don't have. There's certainly efforts around, sort of having that intelligence in there, and we are building auto scale more and more into our, our services. VM scale sets are a significant sort of effort in that direction, as well as making sure that our PaaS services are built on top of VM scale sets, because that sort of handles the scalability for us. But yeah, today, I mean, the best that we can do, that we tend to do, is notify you that this is happening, and you can set up alerts and whatnot to do it. But we don't sort of have a way to say, hey, this is what your traffic pattern looks like, and based on what we've seen with other customers, right, we think you're live, hey, it looks like you're going to get big tomorrow. We don't quite have that intelligence yet. I know there are people thinking about sort of moving in that direction, because we have the data.
Yeah.
Right. It's sort of trying to learn what is the right model and what is the right response to that data. So no, good question though. I mean, I think that's where it's going over time, right? Because we have the richness of the data and we can learn from what we see other people do. So we talked about high availability, right? We talked about multi-region Azure zonal architecture, region pairing, right? So this is when we roll out fixes, when we roll out changes. We have what we call paired regions. So we'll do one of the paired regions first. If everything looks good, then we'll go to the other paired region. Again, this sort of gets paired with your active passive model, right? Or even your active active model, right? We make sure that we're doing one region. If it works, great, we'll do the other one. But if it doesn't, we're only impacting one region. So when you build your availability, you build your HA architecture, you're going to want to make sure you're leveraging those region pairs. SQL database, right, has active geo-replication, or storage. We talked about the RAGRS. See, we just need to get to this slide, and it would have had it in the right order for me. But we're building the features so that you can leverage those in your application. Makes sense? Any questions? Okay.
Makes sense to me. Thanks.
So let's talk. So let's sort of take a little bit of a step in a slightly different direction. No matter what you do from availability, no matter what you design, your availability is your downtime is never going to be zero. It's always going to be non-zero. So now the question becomes, okay, how do I know if I have a problem? Is it an Azure platform issue, or is it something in my code? And there's a lot of features and capabilities that we've released to be able to do that. But you want to make sure you're monitoring the right stuff, right? So historically, because we didn't really have the ability to do observability in our end users, right? We were focused on things like, hey, what's my database CPU? What's my request rate on my app server? Is my load balancer under load? In the cloud world, because I can scale up almost with literally a slider in a lot of cases, right? It really doesn't matter if my web apps are going high CPU, because I can always throw hardware at it, and I can do it with a slider instead of having to buy new hardware. So the recommendation as we start looking at the cloud is start focusing on what is the impact on your end user, right? What's the end user see in terms of the experience? And then decide what do you end up doing about it. And the way that you think about this is you look at it from the perspective of, how many requests are coming in, how many errors are being thrown by your server, and what is your threshold, right? Again, whether that error is due to a CPU problem, whether that error is due to, a memory issue, it doesn't really matter. You're focusing on what's the end user experience. And we have all of the logs to go and figure this out, from the telemetry they've got. And this is the other piece that I recommend. I've seen a number of customers that say, oh, well, but it costs me money to store data in log analytics, or it costs me money to emit my data into blob storage. And again, I absolutely don't want to under recognize the fact that people are trying to run businesses. But if the difference between success and failure from a cost perspective of your application is whether or not you're paying, pennies on the month or dollars on the month for your blob storage, of your logs or your log analytics stuff, you may want to reconsider that business, right?
Yeah.
Because that data is gold when it comes to determining why I went down, how do I fix it, how do I debug it after the fact, right? Some of the least satisfying calls I'm in every month are, hey, customer, my telemetry tells me it's something in your guest, and you didn't log your logs anywhere. And so when that VM restarted, all the data is gone. I can give you some best guesses based on my experience, but I don't really know what happened, right? That's not the conversation you want to be in. You want to be in the conversation that says, great, I got all these logs and I don't know what to do with all this data because I have so much data. There's a much better place to be in than I don't have the data.
Yeah.
So moral of the story, turn on your logging.
Yeah, and I really think it is, and I've seen this like in my company, won't be able to provide details, but basically it is not about they are trying to save money. It is just like they don't even know that what you just said, the logs, those actually that's gold.
Yeah.
Literally the gold. I mean, for example, think about the logs for the storage account access, for example, or anything. That's gold, because if you don't have it, you lose that data, and in case of security incident, that is
Absolutely.
the thing which you want. Yeah. So thanks for emphasizing on that.
Yeah. No. I mean, there's a term that I've been using for a number of years now, called cloud mature, right? And in a cloud immature model, right, you don't have any logs, you don't have any data. You're sort of whatever's in state is what you're able to work with, or whatever somebody remembers or sort of knows, from their knowledge. But in a cloud mature world, you start with the logs, and by that I mean that you have logs, you have lots of logs, and you start answering those questions for that. I have in Azure, just to give you an example, I don't even know how much data we're generating on a daily basis, just petabytes, I'm sure. But my general rule of thumb is that it's not whether or not the service has logs or if this event is logged in it. It's can I find it and can I get to the right person that knows where it is, right? That's how many it's really more about that than it is of is it logged. We have the highest level of verbosity turned on all of our logs almost all the time. Most services is on all the time by default. There's a few services that there is a way to sort of dial it up just a little bit for some targeted things. But as a general rule, I have so many logs. It's more of a problem. We had to invent tools to parse the logs. We have so many logs, right?
Yeah. What I've seen really is the people who are really concerned about the logs in the cloud, and meaning like the storage and the money it will cost. What they fail to see is an on-premise log. There's a log for last 10 years. The table has grown like one table is in gigabytes, for example.
Yep.
It's impossible to do a select star on a table. It has gone so big. It has never been truncated ever.
Yep.
They don't see that.
But the cost is hidden, right? Because it's buried in some other department's cost. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about. I sort of talked about some of these before, but let me sort of highlight a few. We talked about sort of at a high level, we know if we don't build a resilient platform, you can't build your applications on it and be successful. We've done a bunch of work to reduce VM interruptions. We've done a bunch of work to reduce network interruptions. Making sure people are not touching stuff, right? We want code and we want programmatic ways to make changes. We don't want human beings going in and editing config files. And this seems like a simple one, but it's one my team, because we own these communications, actually think about a lot. How do we reduce the time to notify you when there's an outage, so that if you have the question of, is it you or is it me, I'm telling you very soon, so it's me, right? Instead of you spending time figuring out, that it's on your side. All those things we're doing to sort of drive general change improvements. I talked about our safe deployment process. This is the Azure Change Automation, right? This is sort of what I was talking about, right? Where we roll it out through stages. We roll it out to a small slice, in our pilot region, and then we continue expanding that out before we do our broad rollouts. What this means is, the vast majority of our bugs and problems we will find very early on in that cycle on the left side, right? We definitely don't want to find anything on the right. Now, the reality is, as you've seen, right, there are some that we will find all the way on the right when we are in production. But even that, when we find problems in production that we call outages, it is exceedingly rare for us to have a multi-region outage. It generally tends to be we have a single region, a single service. And yeah, it may have far-reaching impact like AAD, but this model generally works, right? It does protect us as a general rule. It's not perfect, right? Because there's human beings in it, but this is the way that we sort of think about doing these rollouts. We also are doing a lot of work to make sure that when we do make changes at the platform layer due to failures, that is transparent to you guys. A good example is doing live migration, right? So today, good example, there's actually a public research article on this, but we built an ML model that will predict when drives are going to fail. So when we know that there's a node that has a drive that's going to fail, we will live migrate the VMs on that node to another node. And then once all the VMs are on that node, we'll service the hardware, right? Totally transparent, right? You get a brief pause versus a reboot, right? Totally different experience that way. And we're sort of implementing that model through all of our patching and all of our host OS stuff. I also encourage you to check out what's called Project Tardigrade. So Project Tardigrade is about making sure that if the host fails, the VM will pause instead of doing a reboot. Think about it like with you're doing Hyper-V and you do a pause your VM, right? When you restart that VM, if you had a dialog box that was opening up, that dialog box is still opening up, right? That's the model we're trying to do with hardware failures with Project Tardigrade. I'll touch on this really briefly. We do have what we call our scheduled events. So whenever we know that we are going to have to do maintenance on a node, we will throw what's called a scheduled event.
Question here.
Yeah, sure.
With what you mentioned, what's the likelihood of something impacting the entire platform across all regions with all this proactive and
Are you talking about a single problem that represents in all regions, or sort of a single, like a global outage type scenario?
Yeah, global outage probably due to a bug or.
Um,
I know because like a few years back, I've not heard it in recent times, but I know that Netflix, when they were running on AWS, and I think it was what it was Christmas or Thanksgiving, whatever that was, right? I forget the exact nature of it, but their subscribers, I think, were impacted big time. So
yeah, so I don't remember the specifics of that one either. I have this vague recollection as well, but like, so we design our deployment systems, we design our services to make sure that there are no sort of global dependencies and to minimize the opportunity for global failures. Now, things like AAD are a good example of things that, right, there's sort of no way to prevent that if we do what happened a couple weeks ago where we rolled out some bad code to many regions. Although even if you look at AAD didn't go to zero. It just had a low enough success rate that different people would notice it. But any applications that were up and running continued running, right? So VMs that are sort of talking to other VMs doing server-side work kept running, right? That's sort of where building the right dependencies in works. Outlook Web Access, because of the some backup capabilities that we've built into OWA and into AAD, existing tokens work just fine with OWA. Right, so that's where we can layer in systems and backup capabilities and reuse tokens, things like that, to make sure that even if we do break something at some level, it's a degraded capability rather than a full outage. I think we have had a couple, like when we had our certificate issue, what's that, maybe 5 years ago, that sort of rolled through globally, but that was one of these things where it rolled through all the different regions over time. And we sort of had to just kind of make it through that rollout. But it's again, knock on wood, because I'm going to be on call this week, starting on Thursday, so I don't want to jinx myself. But again, we designed the systems to minimize the risk of a global outage, but it's never zero. It will never be non-zero. We just want to make it as small as possible.
okay, and that's, I think, a good reference, because if nothing has happened since 5 years, like the one which was
Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly. Again, we've had some DNS issues, but again, depending on where you are, you may have done just fine, right? So we do throw scheduled events. I won't go into this too much, but basically, when we are initiating some maintenance, either an update that'll pause you on your VM or your resource, or if we're doing a restart, we do throw a scheduled event so you can subscribe to that, so your application can catch that event and choose to drain your workload. Right, so maybe a good example is a web farm, right? Maybe you want to finish any existing requests and don't let any new requests get routed to this node, routed to the node, so that we can do what we got to do in this node, and then the impact to your end users is is transparent. But again, this is a way to drive our notification and to help increase the availability of your app from your end user's perspective.
So this is, so just one question. So this
Sure.
one you're talking about, if I deploy a web app, right, and using
Yep.
app services, that app service can call this local metadata endpoint to get
So no, yeah. So that's a good question. So today, most of the PaaS services, the PaaS service consumes this, and it's transparent to you. So what app services actually does do is, when they get this event, they handle it in their code to make sure it's transparent to you, because you deployed your code on app services. This is more relevant. Something like scheduled events is more relevant when you have deployed your workload on top of, say, a run-of-the-mill IaaS VM. Right, where you sort of have to decide how to deal with what happens when one of these comes through.
Oh, so this, if a hardware failure happens, so if I have a VM and there's some kind of maintenance, or you had to reboot my VM.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and again, we can only do this in areas where we know it's going to fail. Obviously, if the VM, if the host node, just the hardware unexpectedly fails, right, we can't tell you ahead of time. But if we know it's going to happen, we will throw these events. Wrong way. So this is actually the reference I was talking about, the disk drive failure. I do encourage you to check out the article. It's pretty dense, but it does talk about sort of how we built this ML model to predict when these drives are going to fail to increase our resiliency. We talked about Project Tardigrade. And last but not least, you know, and again, this is, I don't want to dwell on the fact that outages are a thing, but they are. You know, no matter what resiliency you build in, you know, we build the features, you build the applications on top of it, but outages will still happen. You are going to want to pay attention to Azure Service Health, right? That is where we send our communications when we know we've impacted you, so that you know it's us, not you. You know, you can tie this into, you know, PagerDuty. You can, you know, send it via SMS if you want, right? Sort of however you want to do it is up to you. But I do recommend you check these out. Because it's the great way to ingest that data into your systems and build your dashboards and the like. Azure Status History, right? When we do a public outages, we do publish our, you know, sort of our post-incident reviews. We do post them out here. We talked about Service Health. And then the last thing that I want to mention is the well-architected framework. So we've, you know, been doing this for a long time now, and we've learned that there's some standard patterns, right? This is the right way to design it. This is the right way to build your app. These are the right services. And, you know, we talked about the app services model, right? 2 app services with a zonally aware deployment with traffic manager in front of it, right? It's sort of a standard model. And so we've released the well-architected framework that, you know, gives these recommendations, gives these best practices. Again, doesn't mean you can't have your own takes on some of these, but I do recommend you check this out. It'll give you some really good, you know, guidance that you can work back into your architectural designs. And then sort of just reminding you, right, one of my early messages here, it's about trade-offs, right? We provide lots of capabilities, lots of features that can give you very, very high uptime if you design it right. But make sure you're building the right level of availability, and you're building the right, you know, level of resiliency for the business requirement. If your app doesn't need it, don't spend all the money and effort. But if your app needs it, absolutely invest it. It'll pay off in the long run. You know, nobody's going to be unhappy when a mission critical app has a higher level of availability than you had for your minimum, right? Nobody wants to be just barely hitting their minimum, right? They want to be able to really blow it out of the water. And we certainly do provide the features and capabilities to do it. And then the last thing on the last page, there are some, you know, here's a bunch of links you can use to sort of look at the well-architected stuff. Also, if you look at the Azure Reliability site, there's a whole bunch of content out there about how to design and build applications. Plus, it talks about some of the concepts that we talked about today in terms of resiliency. Any questions? Any other questions? There's some good questions as we went along. Good conversation.
Who tweets on Azure Support Twitter handle?
So that's actually my team. So my team is composed of we sort of do crisis management for customer-facing incidents, both individual customers as well as service outages. And then we also own Azure Communications. So when things go out to Service Health, or they go to the Service Health dashboard, or they go out to Twitter, it's all that team. And we actually, one of the things we, I'm trying to, let's see, where's, so I wasn't necessarily going to do it this way, but I'll do it this way just because I don't have the link handy. So if you go out to my podcast, look for a session we did with Sammy Kuba not too long ago. He talks about sort of our philosophy about communications. But one of the key pieces of his philosophy, you know, and sort of this is what we, you know, really believe in across the board, is that we send the same message through all the channels simultaneously. So if we send it through Twitter, we're sending it through Service Health. If we're sending it through Service Health, and, you know, we're going to send it through Twitter as well. It's the same people, it's the same message. And no, you are not allowed to tweet at Azure Support looking for me to work on your issue, Ashish. I'm not doing it. If I see it come through from you, I'm going to ignore it.
I listened to that episode. That was really good episode by Sammy Kuba.
Yeah. Sammy's great. You know, I'm a techie wonk, right? I think about these services at a detailed level. I like tearing them apart, understanding how they work, and sort of understanding how to tweak them and improve them. Sammy does, he sits around and he thinks about the right way to communicate to customers. And I really give him credit. He's really driven a lot of this vision around that. Obviously, there's a whole bigger team that's working with him as well, but he's super passionate about this topic.
The first thing he said in that podcast, I remember that very clearly. He said, when the things are happening good, like you also mentioned, nobody talks to me.
Nope.
People talk to me only when things go bad. It's very.
I am myself and Sammy. Although again, we love talking to customers. We love sort of talking to people outside of Microsoft. But nobody sits around and goes, God, I can't wait to talk to Evan today. Like, that's just not the way that it works. And I've accepted that many, many, many years ago. So good. No, excellent conversation. Any other questions, comments?
Great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Like I said, I mean, I can hang out if you guys have, anything else, but, my, feel free to email me, shoot me an IM. Everybody's got my Skype info now. Feel free to reach out. Always happy to talk to customers.
Yeah, one thing I would definitely say is if you can subscribe to his podcast, it's really good. It is really, really good. The people who they invite and they actually give you the first-hand knowledge about what they're working on, new features. One thing I would tell you, even is I don't want to don't take it as a complaint or something, but what happens is this 30 minutes podcast and the news actually takes over almost 30 to 40% of the actual podcast.
It's funny. We have actually had to censor the news as we go because the news continues to grow.
Yeah.
As the platform continues to go, there's more and more news. So we've actually, in recent times, we've sort of started cutting that down because there's just too much.
Yeah.
Right. We used to try and keep up with it. Now, we sort of hit the high points. But I'll send you your $20 for the podcast plug later. But yeah, love to have anybody as a subscriber as well. We're actually getting ready to hit episode 350, and we're at 7+ years now. I think something like that. So
it started the same time, I guess. I think
yeah.
The time we started the group, we started. I think you guys
just about. Yeah, that was back when Azure. We weren't really sure if this Azure thing was going to go anywhere, but myself and the two other sort of initiators said, man, this stuff is cool. We should talk about it. And, go figure. Turned out to be a thing.
But just on that, the news and updates on the platform, and a lot of times, like today, I didn't do it because you were going to present. But whenever I'm starting a session, before that, I take the extract from what's new on Azure and I share it with the attendees. It's such a easy copy paste and like lift and shift kind of a transfer.
Yeah, exactly.
They're getting together, like, what's new here, what's new there, and a lot of good info in there. So yeah, no, definitely second that. I think it's a great podcast, and I think I said that before as well, before we started. Definitely a must subscribe thing. So
glad to hear it. Happy to have y'all as subscribers. Cool. Excellent. Well, again, thanks for the time, folks. Feel free to reach out. And once we are able to get back together in person, definitely looking forward to love to come back to the group and do something in person.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Ivan.
Cool. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone. We'll again talk next month.
See ya. Thanks.